So welcome along to this information session that's on landscape recovery. Before I kick off and tell you about the technology, just to let you know that this is when my team have been around talking to pilot farmers and to test and trial farmers, a lot of you ask about landscape recovery, about what it is and how you can get involved. So what we thought we'd do is bring you a session today that you could dial into that will tell you a little bit more about landscape recovery, what's happening in that space and exactly how you can get involved. So we hope we put this session based on the feedback that we've heard from you. So we hope it answers some of your questions that you've that we've heard from you over the past couple of months. So the technology that we're using today, so you'll be familiar with it. It's ones that we use for our other webinars. We are on Zoom, so it is a webinar situation, so you'll be able to see me and the rest of the panel, but you as participants will be muted and your videos turned off, and that's just because of the sheer number of people that we were expecting for today's session. As I did say when you joined us, if you are having any technical difficulties, please do let us know in the chat and one of the team will reach out and help you with that. As you've just heard, we've just started the recording of today's session, so we will be recording it and you'll be able to listen to it if you weren't able to attend or you had to pop off during the session, you will get the opportunity. So we do have a Q&A function and we've got room in the agenda to ask some questions at the end. So if you do want to pop a question in, please do use the question answer. We will give you the opportunity to have a look through the Q&A through the questions at the end of the webinar, just to see if anybody's already posted the question that you might ask, or you could say, yeah, that's a good question, please answer that one. And we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. So you should see me, you won't be able to see the other panelists when they do come, when they do give their presentation, they will be coming off camera to see you, so and you will be able to see them. So if we can have the next slide, please. I think I've covered a lot of this already, but the purpose of today's session is really to share information on landscape recovery, to address some of the common myths about the scheme and to listen and to respond to your questions. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Sophia Parkinson, who heads up the landscape recovery team, to take you through this session. Sophia.
Thanks very much, Louise, and hi everybody. So I'm the head of the landscape recovery scheme, and I'll be covering the first part of the presentation today, and then I'll be handing over to Tim Field, who's a farmer from the Cotswolds and whose project was successful in receiving funding in our first round of landscape recovery, who will hopefully help bring the scheme to life a bit more. Just to say that if you're interested in finding more about the scheme after the presentation today, there's more information on the DEFRA farming blog, and also there'll be full guidance on the scheme coming in the spring. And we've also got some more detailed webinars for potential round one applicants, so just look out for those, and we can flag the links to those. But yeah, without further ado, I'll kick off with an overview of the landscape recovery scheme. So I'm sure, as many of you will be aware, landscape recovery is one of the 3 environmental land management schemes, alongside the Sustainable Farming Incentive and Countryside Stewardship. The Sustainable Farming Incentive, which I'm sure you're very familiar with through the pilot and tests and trials, pays farmers for simple actions that encourage environmental outcomes. And its aim is to accelerate the large-scale adoption of sustainable approaches on all types of farms, building on the excellent practice happening already in many places. The Countryside Stewardship Scheme pays farmers and land managers for environmental work they might be carrying out alongside sustainable food production. So that could be things like restoring wildlife habitats, creating and managing woodlands, mitigating flood risks, those kinds of things. And both the Sustainable Farming Incentive and Countryside Stewardship involve a menu of standards or options for farmers and land managers to choose from. By contrast, in the Landscape Recovery Scheme, what we're aiming to do is use bespoke agreements to facilitate large-scale, long-term projects, and in particular things that might be difficult to deliver under the other 2 schemes. So, next slide, please. Thank you. There are four main distinguishing elements of the landscape recovery scheme, which I touched on before, but I'll talk a bit more detail on this slide. So firstly, in landscape recovery, we'll be focusing on large-scale projects. And this means the scheme will be well suited to delivering outcomes that require collaborative action across a big area. For example, restoring ecological or hydrological function across a landscape. We also will be offering long-term funding through landscape recovery. For example, the agreements could be 20 years or longer. And we think this is important to enable us to support outcomes that take a long time to deliver. So examples for that could include peatland restoration, woodland management, or habitat restoration, for example. And as mentioned in the previous slide, we're offering bespoke agreements through this scheme. And this is to allow us to fund activities that contribute to priority outcomes, but might be specific to the locality, for example, and might be difficult to facilitate through the other schemes, which are based on a menu of options. And then also all those three features I've just mentioned, as well as the development funding we're offering projects, we think will make this scheme, will make the projects in this scheme particularly attractive to private funding. We hope this will help provide sustainable and attractive funding streams for farmers and land managers, as well as helping us ensure that public funds can go further and deliver good value for money. The projects will be delivering a really wide variety of environmental outcomes, given they're going to be large-scale projects, as well as supporting local environmental priorities. And we are particularly keen to see them making important contributions to some of our national targets, for example, the 25-year environment plan, net zero, and our commitment to protect 30% of the country for nature by 2030. Just one final point on this slide, which is to say we're rolling out landscape recovery in waves. We have competitive application rounds each time. And we launched the first round last year and are launching a second round of the scheme this year and have confirmed that a third round will follow next year. So I'm now going to share a recap of round one, and then we'll talk a bit more about round two. But rewinding the clock back to round one launched in February 2022, and it focused on projects that particularly target species recovery and river restoration. Applications were open to any individuals or groups of land managers that could pull together a 500 to 5,000 hectare project in England. The application window closed in May last year, and we received a total of 51 bids for the 15 places originally advertised, which was really great. And those bids, we were particularly pleased to see that those bids have been submitted by a wide range of land managers and partnerships, representing a mixture of land use backgrounds, including many bids involving groups of farmers, tenants, charities, local authorities, national parks, and various other organisations. When the bids were received, we had a panel of subject matter experts who evaluated the bids and scored them against the published criteria that we'd set out in our guidance. And we were really pleased that given the strength and number of applications received, we were able to offer places to the 22 highest scoring projects in the end. And those projects were announced in September. And you can see their locations on the map on this slide. And there's also a list of them on the blog, on the farming website, the farming blog, if that be of interest. Collectively, these projects cover over 40,000 hectares. And they've all demonstrated they have pioneering ideas that will improve rural landscapes and reverse the decline in nature. So a bit more detail on the projects. The projects cover around 400 miles of rivers and streams, which is pretty amazing. And they have at least 263 target species, including otter, lapwing, and marsh fritillary that they're focused on. The projects are undertaking a range of activity. So that includes improving rivers and streams, recovering threatened species, creating new woodlands, restoring peatland, etc., etc. And a really, really important thing to stress is that we were really pleased to see that nearly all the projects that we selected do involve groups of farmers and land managers working together. And around half the projects include tenant farmers. And this is important because a key concern when we launched round one was that there was a concern that it would be dominated by large estates who were welcome to apply, but we didn't want the scheme to be sort of exclusively for large estates. We wanted it to be inclusive for lots of different types of projects. So we were working very hard to make sure it would be attractive and accessible to a wide range of projects. And this is important to us because we need to make sure this scheme can work in different areas of the country. So regardless of the geography or the tenure arrangements. We want the scheme to work. And so on that basis, we were really, really pleased to see that translate into a real diversity in the kind of applications we received in round one and the projects that we've taken forwards. And we're really committed to making sure this scheme is accessible to all kinds of farmers and land managers, including tenants who want to do this kind of landscape scale action. So, we are looking really closely at round one to see, obviously, what something's gone well, but also what we could improve as we look ahead to round two. And always welcome feedback on that. So hoping to see a broader range of applications in this next round. But in terms of where the round one projects are at the moment, they are currently in their development phase, and we're supporting them to complete that development work and over an up to 2 year period. And we hope that they can start implementation on the ground as soon as possible. So I'm now going to move on to talking a bit about our upcoming round two. The focus of round two is going to be on 3 areas: net zero, protected sites, and habitat creation. And these 3 areas have been chosen because we have ambitious targets on these outcomes as set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan. And we think landscape recovery is well suited to helping deliver significant progress on these targets, alongside the continued production of sustainable food. The projects could involve activities that will contribute to net zero, for example, creating or enhancing woodland, or restoring or maintaining peatland or other habitats. They could improve the condition of protected sites, for example, sites of special scientific interest, which obviously involve a range of habitats like ancient woodlands or wetlands. And our plan is to take up to 25 projects in this next round, depending on the quality of applications we receive. In terms of eligibility for round two, all land types will be eligible, including land inside or outside protected areas, including common land. And that land could be provided by any landowner or land manager, for example, individual farmers, landowners or organisations, or groups of different land managers working together. We're proposing that public bodies will be eligible as they were in round one, but they will need to apply in collaboration with private land managers, for example, tenants or neighbouring landowners, to make sure that the funding isn't, to make sure that the funding doesn't all go into public bodies rather than to a broader range of people. It's also important to say that we won't expect farmers and land managers to include their whole holdings in a landscape recovery agreement. That you can do if you'd like to, but in many cases, as we've seen in round one, we think that the projects typically involve parts of holdings, where land managers might be wanting to put part of their land into landscape recovery and then potentially entering into other agreements, for example, a sustainable farming incentive agreement on other parts of their holdings. So it's very much up to the farmers and land managers about what they think would be appropriate in the area, what would suit their business. If you're wondering whether there's any restrictions on applying for LR if you're in other schemes, a key message is that applicants are still eligible for landscape recovery, even if they're involved in any other DEFRA scheme. So there's some listed on this slide. There's many more schemes. Anyone can still apply for landscape recovery. And we are open to projects that are focused on creation or restoration of habitats, or maintenance of habitats already in good condition, or any combination of those things. Obviously, hopefully goes without saying, but a key principle is that the projects can't claim funding for anything they're already being paid to do or are otherwise required to undertake under other schemes. And that's something we'll be checking as we go through this scheme. And in terms of the long-term agreements, our current thinking is that it would be probably best for the projects and for us if we help them transfer out of any existing agreements that they're in with DEFRA and into landscape recovery, so that they avoid having lots of different agreements with DEFRA with different end dates, terms and conditions and so on, which could be complicated. But that's something we will be planning to discuss with each individual project as part of the development phase, the long-term funding agreements. So in terms of how the application process will work, as mentioned previously, we're hoping to open applications for round two in the spring. Around probably April, May time. And we're currently proposing that the application window will be about 16 weeks long, which was the same as for round one. And we will publish full detailed guidance on how to apply when applications open, including covering the criteria and lots more detail on what people need to provide. And all of those applications will be assessed against the published criteria. And the highest scoring projects will then proceed into enrolment, which is where we finalise the award of their development grants. So I just would like to come on to tackle a few common misconceptions about landscape recovery, because I think hopefully that might be helpful. There's some sort of myths that we quite often hear, and just useful to explain a bit about what the reality is for the scheme at the moment. So we've had feedback from lots of people and farmers that some people think the scheme is for public bodies like the RSPB, National Trust, or other sort of big organisations, or for large estates. And as you'll hear from Tim shortly, and as I've mentioned previously, this isn't the case. We were really pleased to see bids for landscape recovery round one from a really wide range of partnerships. I think the average number of farmers in our projects is around 12. And as I mentioned before, around half the projects involve tenants. And we just want to, we're really hoping to see that a continued sort of representation from a range of different types of partnerships, including groups of farmers in future rounds. I think just one of the things that we've included in the scheme to enable that is we're offering project development funding. So that is to help people who might not otherwise have the resources to develop the detail of their bids to do that. So when people if their project has got great potential, we can bring them into the scheme and give them some funding and support to develop their proposals in more detail. So it's measures that we're including to try and make sure that we can enable more groups of farmer clusters to apply. And yeah, you'll hopefully hear a bit more from Tim about how that's worked in his project shortly. The second myth I wanted to mention is that some people have a perception that landscape recovery is focused on taking land out of production. The majority of our projects in round one will continue to contribute to food production, typically through changes to extensive mixed agriculture or grazing systems. They are, in some cases, switching areas of low productivity and profitable land to other land uses, to make space for example, tree planting or other habitat creation. This is a scheme for people who want to take this more long-term, large-scale approach to producing environmental and climate goods. But that doesn't mean, as we've said, as our ministers have said many times, that food production and environmental delivery absolutely can go hand in hand. So this is not a scheme that's all about taking every inch of the project out of production. And then finally, on the final myth, some people before we launched round one were concerned that the scheme would be quite dominated by upland projects, given the holdings tend to be larger there, so it might be easier to pull together these big projects. And actually, we found in round one we had more lowland than upland applications. And we want to ensure the scheme, well, as I said before, works well for projects across the whole of the country and in both lowland and upland areas. And we, are continuing to work really closely with the round one projects and prospective applicants for future rounds and other stakeholders to learn lessons as we go and, address anything that needs changing to make sure it is accessible. So hopefully just good to bust that myth. So if you are interested in applying for round two of landscape recovery, which, might not be the thing for you, the other schemes, we have a range of schemes, different things will suit different people. But if you are interested in round two, we would really welcome your application. And we would, so look out basically for that launching in the spring. We have been running market engagement webinars over the last few weeks, which are more detailed sessions for prospective applicants. So we have a more detailed presentation than the one I've shared today on round two and what we expect round two will look like. And we'd really recommend watching those. So we had the last one last week, but the recordings for all three of the sessions we ran are now on the blog. And we'll put the link in the chat for you. And we'd really recommend you having a look at that so that you can understand what it is we're looking for and have a think about whether it might be for you. And as I mentioned before, there'll be full detailed guidance following when we launch applications. So do look out for those things. So I'm now going to hand over to Tim Field of the Northeast Cotswold Farming Cluster, which is one of our successful round one projects, to talk more about his project and his experience of the scheme so far.
Thank you, Sophia. Apologies now if I drop in and out. It seems we've got a bit of a blow on at the moment, and you know, rural broadband not all it's cracked up to be. So I'm currently in the yard in Oxfordshire at the heartlands of the Northeast Cotswold Farmer Cluster, and I'm going to just run through how we got into landscape recovery and what we're about to embark on. So next slide, please. Yeah, so 3 years ago, two or 3 years ago, we set out a group of farmers, about 20 or 30, sat in a room and sketched out what we wanted to do as a group together. A very diverse group of farmers, different holding tenants, estates, owner occupier, and so on. And the vision was generally to, you know, spend the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years restoring that farmed environment and local food networks in the Northeast Cotswolds through collaborating together, but also exchanging knowledge. So both educating each other, but also going together into projects as an aggregated group of farms. And those objectives I've just painted up there, really starting with the soils, because that obviously unlocks all sorts of other benefits on farming productivity, natural capital, and so on. But also mapping, creating, enhancing, and linking those priority habitats that make us a special landscape. Entrepreneurial thinking, because it's the only way to go forward. We can't be stuck in our old ways, and that will involve both private and public funding. As we know, public funding's had a right old shake up, and private investment is coming from all sorts of different avenues. So to explore those, evaluating progress, you can't manage what you're not measuring, that old adage. And then community engagement and outreach, because we can't do this alone. A lot of our market depends on the communities around us, and obviously the consumers of our food. Next slide, please. So we embarked on landscape recovery because it actually encapsulated a hell of a lot of those 6 objectives, and really creates a framework for us to build our impact. What started as 20 or 30 farmers is now 129 farms across nearly 40,000 hectares of this corner of England. What you've got there is the Evenlow catchment sketched out, that little line around the outside. You've got the Windrush flood zone to the southwest, and the Charwell to the east. The Evenlow catchment is there, and those are the farm parcels across 50 odd farms that we've included in landscape recovery. So it's a proportion of the overall farms, about 23 or 24,000 hectares. If we included all the farmland, we're only 3,227 hectares in landscape recovery. So it's a proportion of each of those. And you can see we're not completely contiguous. I see one of the questions, but hydrologically linked. I can't even say that word. So we are connected in habitat, if you like. Next slide, please. And what are we doing on that habitat? Well, in-channel river restoration and reconnecting longitudinally, so removing obstructions and impoundments so we can allow the migration of fish up and down the river, reconnecting to the floodplain, so using the floodplain as it's designed to be by nature, and that is flood storage. Stage 0 is the trendy term of that, but basically re-wetting the floodplain. It's happening anyway with climate change. We're finding more and more intense storms flooding our floodplain, so we're just using that as storage and holding it back for longer. Floodplain meadow creation, which this part of the world has some wonderful examples, things like Great Binnet and Devil's Bit scabious. You know, a special habitat that we have a few ancient examples of. We're looking to expand the extent and the condition of those. And then other target habitats, the reed beds, the wetlands, the fen, wet fen, and so on. And we'll be using those as tools to strip out sediment in the water, strip out the phosphate bound to that, strip out nitrate in the water. And as I say, storing water, holding it back. Iconic species we're looking to restore. Water voles, we've lost them from the Evenlow, but they're not far away. Working with the Wildlife Trust to restore those populations, kingfishers, curlews, brown trout, eels, you know, all those sort of central England iconic species. And then keystone species like water crow's foot, that if we can get that plant assemblage back, it will have benefits to all sorts of other things. And then in order to hit targets for carbon and also flood storage and natural flood management and connectivity of habitats, trees have a huge role to play. And that's not just block planting of single crop coniferous woodlands. This is hedgerows, agroforestry, wet woodland, timber production. So yes, managed woodlands as well, but the right tree in the right place. Next slide, please. And here's a few examples of projects that we effectively are using as case studies. We've got amongst those 50 farms some brilliant examples of very passionate but also progressive farms that are already looking at natural capital in the private market sense. So we've got one farm there that's working on an environment bank project, another one that's to the right hand side who's got an HS2 payment for woodland planting. It's gone into UK but as baseline the carbon, so you can trade that on the carbon markets down the line. Is looking at his whole farm carbon balance, has baselined the whole farm with BNG, so that those pockets that are less productive and less optimal for food production, he can start integrating more habitats into them. Next slide, please. And here's one of the bigger estates. It's actually Blenheim Estate. So we do have some big estates as well as smaller farms. And they are looking at a very large scale stage 0 approach. So reconnecting that stream to the floodplain, as you can see there. But this is only when there's proper deluge of rain, holding that water back for a little period. And then as it dries off, as it drains off, cleaning that water. And actually this was some of the most productive grassland on the estate during that drought and the burn off of all the other permanent pastures. So still managing that for food production, but also for other natural capital benefits. The map on the right, it demonstrates there's some woodland going in as well. And there's also a lot of community access going in. And this is integrated with other sort of renewable energy schemes and other estate objectives, but ultimately it's stacking the opportunities within the whole estate. Next slide, please. And that's an example of a biodiversity net gain project that's been baselined, it's been planned, and actually they're looking to get sowing and get cracking this season. This is an arable field that has gone underwater too many times, lost the crop. It's no longer viable as an arable field. So looking to go to arable reversion, floodplain meadow creation, and have all those water quality benefits that I've just mentioned and flood storage benefits. Next slide, please. I noticed in the question and answer chat that someone mentioned about baselining. This has come off the back of a big Rothamsted project. So we've actually baselined the soil carbon in 15,000 hectares. That's 1,300 samples that have been analysed for soil carbon using some new tech, but the DOMAS method, so a highly credible baseline. And this is also helping our optioneering. So where we know that we've got low soil carbon, there's an opportunity to increase that through either regenerative farming techniques or maybe a land use shift from arable to permanent pasture, or in extreme examples that's justifying perhaps a woodland planting scheme. But without measuring at this landscape scale, we don't know where we're going. This is an example of what we've done. There's also a lot of baseline data on vegetation communities, so plant species in the flood zone, looking at where we can connect up existing high value sites. We are very lucky in the Even Load that there's a very active catchment partnership that's had some good funding from Thames Water in the past, maybe not in the future, but also Environment Agency and others have supported this hugely, so that we can get a really good idea of where there's value to be restored and where we should be focusing more on food production and so on. Next slide, please. And here's another example of where we're looking to re-wiggle a stream. Through the last 100, 200, 400 years, we've been straightening our streams, rushing water down to flood places like Oxford. So actually by wiggling these streams, holding the water back, we reckon we have a value in flood storage. And there's hundreds of millions of pounds available if you can stop communities like London from flooding. So it's a real focus of ours to reconnect that floodplain, and that's Bleddington there, and there were 22 properties that flooded there 2 years ago. There's a real community benefit to this work as well, and these are grass fields, permanent pasture fields that will still be croppable and yield for their grazing potential. Next slide, please. And this one's starting from scratch, literally just almost crayons on a piece of paper. We've used Land App, obviously, very helpful to co-design. This prompts me to say that, you know, all those 50 farms are leading the design of these interventions on their farms. We will get together to prompt those ideas or discuss those ideas based on what, as I mentioned, the baseline data we've got and where the highest value we can get from those interventions. But ultimately, it's about what the farmer wants to do on the land, because this is a 20 to 30 year commitment of land use change or land management change. So you have to be in it for longer, you know, multi-generational, and so we don't want to be creating things which are going to be problematic to work around. Next slide, please. And there's a stage 0, pretty much natural, that we're looking at, nothing dramatic, but this these sorts of projects across the whole catchment will help ultimately down the line. Next slide, please. Just in answer to that question, how many participants are tenants? I would say probably about 20% are tenants, maybe 25-30%. So you know, different owner and tenure, some FBTs, some AHAs, some are literally rolling FBTs. We are going to be unpicking a lot of legal detail to get all these over the line. As a pilot, I guess we sort of brought ourselves into that role to try and create some sort of formula, but it's where most of our resource will be going, is in this legal sort of how do you get that commitment over the long term. And of course, it's got to work for both parties. You can't just be forced into this by the landowner, otherwise that's the worst outcome that we could imagine, actually. So as some more examples of reconnecting the flood zones and rewiggling. That picture on the right hand side is not the river. That is what happens when it floods. So we're just looking to create that more permanently. The bottom left is actually a triple SI in unfavorable condition. We're looking at again rewiggling that river down the original channel, which is down the middle of the field, and restoring some of that status, favorable status. Next slide, please. And to demonstrate how the farmer is first and foremost in charge of this project, we have them. We are a community interest company, so we're set up as a legal entity of farmers. The 3 directors are all farm owners, and yep, they are all farmer owners, and representing the 129 farmer members. We have a steering group which includes 5 out of those 8 that are farmers. Some of those are tenants, making sure that we capture all perspectives. And yeah, there's a couple on there. There's an agent on there, and there's someone from Leaf as well. And then I am the project director and facilitator of the farmer group, but I will be advised by, again, a farmer who also happens to be a guru on finance and legals and governance. That's Tim Coates. So he's leading that front. We've got Dave Gasker, who is, if you like, in charge of the technical elements. He is from Atkins. He is brilliant on data, but also he's got a PhD in hydrology, which is very handy. Yavinder Mali, he's a professor at Oxford University, in charge of pulling all that data together and making sure we've got sense of where we're starting and how we measure going forward. And Ellen Fake, she is the glue that keeps the whole project together. She is the intermediary between each farmer and the overall project framework, and ultimately she is talking to the farmers on the ground about what they want to do, and then bringing that data that we've pulled together and the optioneering and presenting that to the farmers, so co-designing what interventions we go through. It'd be remiss if I didn't mention people like Izzy Edwards, who is our sort of support and line into the EA, Natural England, and DEFRA and Forestry Commission, so all the statutory organisations involved. And then the key stakeholders, I mentioned Oxford University, that's Leverhulme Centre, and the Evenlow Catchment Partnership. So, you know, as I mentioned, we are very lucky to have a very active catchment with a lot of baseline data already. We're attracting funding from the likes of Network Rail, and Thames Water, so that's the sort of private funding element. as well as biodiversity net gain and soil carbon conversations we're having with some big investors. Yeah, that's it. I think that's all the slides that I've got this time around. I would gladly answer some of those questions that are popping up. Oh no, oh yeah, there was one last slide, but that just demonstrates what I've just said. There are key partners. Oxbury Bank is a very new bank. Tim Coates, who's our leading on the private finance side, was one of the founders of that bank. So we've got some real technical help there on the legal finance and governance. Atkins, I mentioned, Natural England, Just Farm. They are a small independent farm advisory group who also happens to be a farmer in the catchment as well. And then in terms of stakeholder engagement and access, we've got the Cotswold National Landscape who have been doing this for a long time and are great at executing it. So we're, if you like, outsourcing that element of the project to them. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. So I think now it's time for the question and answer session. So as I said, we'll be taking questions from the Q&A. So there is a button at the bottom saying Q&A. I know many of you have been putting your questions in there. So we will try and get through as many as we possibly can. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got quite a few for Tim, and I thought that might be a nice place to start with, Tim, if that's okay, Sophia, with you. So Tim, just in terms of some of the questions we've got on the chat rather than the Q&A, we've got one here from Charlotte about what benefits for heritage assets, were there any benefits for heritage assets built into your project?
So by heritage assets, do you mean I don't know, a water meadow or a Roman villa or that sort of thing? What specifically would you be? Because I mean, we have both.
I can imagine that would be it, Tim.
Water meadows and traditional. I mean, yeah, so I joke about the Roman villa. No one actually knows about it, but it's an amazing example of it. We will be connecting. I see there was also a question about public access or something in the Q&A that just popped up. We are with landscape recovery, you can get extremely distracted and carried away on community engagement and site access, and we've got all sorts of opportunities from, I mean, I joke not, going on Clarkson's farm to going out to all the schools and the hospitals and the colleges, supplying food, to getting primary school children on farm, to there's so many different opportunities. And we've got some great people like the Cotswold AONB, the Cotswold National Landscape, looking at that to filter through those and where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck ultimately, because some farms don't want any public access, other farms want open up the gates and let everyone run everywhere, so that's fine. Ultimately, we want to restore nature, and we can't have everyone running everywhere, and likewise people are trying to run large machines and so on. So it's horses for courses. I digress completely from the question. Short answer is we are looking at heritage, but yeah, not as a main focus.
Thanks, Tim. I'll take a couple of questions again for you rolled into one. How many farmers involved are actually tenants? And then the second one is, and I think this is an important one because I think you can address some myths here. Have you handed over control of your land to anyone, particularly Natural England? And how do farmers pull out of the scheme if they want to?
Three great questions. So about 20 or 30% are tenants. I couldn't give you the exact figure on whether you're looking at by area or by farm, but we are working with both landowner and tenant, and we've got grazing licenses to design and engineer for the conservation grazing element as well. There's all sorts of different approaches that we're going to have to deal with, but yeah, there is a decent proportion are tenants. On the, I've forgotten the other questions already. That's what was the other?
So you've got one, involvement of Natural England in the scheme. Do you have to hand your land over to Natural England? And if a farmer, for whatever reason, did want to come out of the scheme, can they do that?
So I'm sure Sophia will kill me for saying this, but when we collected the 50 odd commitments to go into this stage of project design, the only way I was going to get them in was by saying, you can opt out if it doesn't work out financially for you. I mean, that's a fundamental that we had it the other day. If you're going to get the same rewards for just going into CS for 5 years, why wouldn't you just go into CS for 5 years? in order to get that connectivity and large scale, we need to reward you for going in for a longer commitment and period. So that's where that stacking of finance is really key. We're almost, you know, taking CS and then adding a chunk to buy your commitment. And the other part is, yes, with BNG and so on, I believe you can have that opt out, but ultimately that's going to cost you to come out, because you will need to offset your, you know, whatever you've been paid to offset or to restore. You will need to pick that up and do it somewhere else, so that, you know, you're disincentivized from opting out, but you're massively incentivized for coming in for 20 to 30 years. Bearing in mind, we're looking at sort of 7 to maybe 12-15% of your holding here, and we're not looking for your grade 1 best productive land. We're looking for those field corners and those marginal areas that aren't as productive as perhaps you'd like them to be.
Can I just jump in on that one as well, just to add a bit on the development phase? I agree with everything that Tim said. I think the way the scheme currently works is when people apply, we want to see that the land managers, whether it's tenants, owners, and so on involved in that land, are happy for the project to come into the development phase. We don't want people making speculative applications about other people's land without discussing that with them. Not good. But that commitment at that stage is just to come into the development phase to discuss these proposals further and explore them. There is no commitment to go on into the implementation phase if at the end of the day the numbers don't stack up for any particular farmer in that group. So it's really to have that space to discuss what this could look like, explore the funding options. And then, yes, as Tim said, you know, what we want to do is put in place funding that is enough of incentive for people to go ahead with this, you know, brilliant ambition. We will have to think really carefully about review clauses and what happens if people, you know, if situations arise in the future. And that's all something we discuss in the development phase with the projects about how we manage that. With the aim of helping the projects sort of last into the long run, but also being able to deal with any unexpected circumstances. So just wanted to clarify that one point as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sophia. What I'd like to do now is use the rest of the time to look at the Q&A. So I think a couple of these, Sophia, we've already covered in the presentation, but if we can quickly address them. So the first one's from Andrew, and it's about how are we measuring landscape recovery, and about the targets, what are we recovering from?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in this coming up round, we are open to projects that involve maintenance of habitats already in good condition. So it's not recovery in all circumstances, if that makes sense. Like there might be habitats we want to maintain, but obviously we are looking to deliver new environmental benefits. So where possible, restoring landscapes or creating new habitats and so on. And we will be, one of the things we fund in the development phase is projects undertaking, working with whoever they need to do baseline data assessment, so that we have a really, really clear sense of what's already there, what already good things are happening, and then we can track progress as the projects move into implementation. So that's very much us working closely with the projects to work out, you know, to identify what baseline data we need to collect in this development phase and get that in place.
Thanks, Sophia. A couple of questions along the same thing. Is it limited to farmers' landscape recovery, or does it cover horticulture and forestry? And then when we say large scale, is there a minimum area?
So I'll take the second one first. For round one, we asked the projects, we were looking for projects of 500 to 5,000 hectares. For round two, we also will have a minimum area of 500 hectares, we think, and we're just exploring whether we keep that cap at 5,000 hectares, maybe have a higher cap. Well, obviously, we don't really want to limit people's ambition. It's just how we manage the scheme's budget and the deliverability of the projects and so on. In future, we might, we'll keep those under review. It might be we look at whether the scheme could have a role to play in projects of, say, 250 hectares plus and so on. But we were really oversubscribed for round one. So I think we're sort of trying to get the balance right in terms of that sort of scale of ambition and the what kinds of projects can come into the scheme. And then on whether it's limited to farmers, no, it's open to any land managers who can pull together a project at the scale we're looking for. So that could very much include foresters, horticultural, various different types of people. And on land with different uses. But clearly, as this is part of our farming schemes, we really, really want to make sure that farmers are very much included in the scheme and it works for them. So that's just why I was stressing that in the presentation today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sophia. So we've got another question here about the envelope of funding that's going to be available for landscape recovery. I think we did cover this, but
Yes, so for round one, we've allocated around £12 million for the development funding for the round one projects. And the specific funding the projects receive is based on their needs, so based on the work they need to do and the cost of doing that work, and so on. In terms of the whole farming budget, we haven't set a fixed percentage. We are really at a piloting stage of landscape recovery. We want to know how the scheme can work best. What kinds of projects is it effective for? What's the demand? What's the interest from farmers and land managers on doing these kinds of landscape scale projects, and how all of our schemes work together to deliver the targets the government set. So within the all of our farming schemes, the budgets are not sort of fixed. We're looking at what's the best combination of schemes and funding over the coming years, and we will flex our budget in order to make sure we're meeting, we're funding the schemes that are attractive to farmers, we're funding the schemes that contribute to our outcomes, and so on.
Thanks, Sophia. So we've got a couple of questions that others have agreed on here. So I think it's just around the confusion that exists around the schemes we've got already. So sustainable farming incentive and countryside stewardship, and a feeling that the schemes are offering similar things, and it's a little bit confusing when all this was supposed to be simplified. Why just not have one scheme?
So I think the three different schemes are designed to have some different features, so they might be attractive to different kinds of people. So as I said, in landscape recovery, this is about, for example, like long-term commitments and across a large-scale area. That won't be for everybody. Some people may be in a position where they prefer to do something in the short run and keep their options open. So it is about having different offers that give different farm businesses different options. I think in terms of the sustainable farming incentive and countryside stewardship, we are really looking at how we can, given there's some similarities between about like how people enter the schemes, we're looking at how we can streamline that so it becomes a simpler application process, maybe eventually one application process. I don't know. I think it's a really good point that it might be easier for people to apply for those offers through one sort of approach. And that's something we're looking really closely at. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Sophia. Got another question here around the role of our arm's length bodies in the scheme, such as Natural England Environment Agency. I know Tim touched on it.
Yeah, so the main delivery partners for landscape recovery are Natural England and the Environment Agency. So they are the organisations that have the agreements with our projects and who manage the funding, so making the payments, for example, to the projects this stage. We do work with a wider array of other DEFRA arm's length bodies on different points. For example, Forestry Commission are involved in terms of bringing that sort of expertise around woodland management. So there's a sort of partnership approach on the DEFRA side, but the key delivery partners are Natural England and the Environment Agency.
Thanks, Sophia. So we've got a question here. Again, I think you answered it, but useful to voice over again. Does all the land entered into the scheme have to be contiguous?
So what we've said is for round one is that we wanted the land to be broadly contiguous. And I think Tim kind of touched on this, that what we're not looking to be sort of, arbitrarily strict if there's a road going through the land or if there's like a small break in the land. What we want to see is that these are large scale projects across a particular landscape, and that the land that's being proposed can actually deliver the ambition that the project's aiming to achieve. So for example, if the land that people were looking at was actually quite scattered and not joined up, and it meant you couldn't achieve some of the ambitions you were looking at, maybe around like river restoration, for example, there was lots of big chunks of the river missing, that project might not score as well as a project that had more of the key blocks along that river together. So it's not about saying there can be no gaps. That's not where we're at. But we do want to see sort of large scale areas that joined up actually could deliver a lot more than if we just did separate things on the different areas of land. And we're looking in our guidance to clarify that a bit, because it's an area we get lots of questions on and appreciate it's a bit confusing. So hopefully that explanation's helped though in the meantime.
Thanks, Sophia. So we've got a question here about whether farmers need to be registered with RPA to get involved.
No. Is the short answer to that one.
Excellent. Nice and short. Questions keep jumping about a bit. Can we get project development funding ahead of applying?
So not through landscape recovery, because we, as I said, have had a lot of interest in the scheme, and we need to decide which projects we award funding to, and that's what the application process is there for. And so it's the highest scoring projects out of that process that will be awarded development funding through this scheme. But obviously people need support in working up an application or considering what they could do at landscape scale. And there's other DEFRA initiatives that are particularly helpful with that. I mean, tests and trials is one good example. The Countryside Stewardship Facilitation Fund is also one where we've seen quite a lot of projects that have used that to sort of start, talking across an area about what they could do together. And that's translated into some people going on to apply for landscape recovery. And there's also the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. There's some people who've done some project development work through that, for example, who've then gone on to apply for landscape recovery. And one of the things we're doing at the moment is really looking at what's that sort of pre-application support that is needed to have that kind of pipeline of projects coming through, and making sure that's in place, because from our scheme's point of view, we don't want the pipeline to sort of dry up and these projects, to peter out just because people haven't had that initial kind of incubation support. But hopefully those gives you some ideas of some places you might be able to get some funding to start thinking about a landscape scale proposal.
That's great. Thanks, Sophia. So we've got a question here about improving public access, and is that something that could be included within a bid?
Yes, definitely. So in round one of our criteria was on social benefits, and that included public access as well as other things like engagement. And we also looked at how the project would be engaging with the community to sort of firm up their plans. And we plan to have a similar criteria in round two. And so that will be, recognised as part of assessing a bid, what the sort of access plans are. Looking to sort of build on the existing public access in that area and enhance it where possible.
Thanks, Sophia. So we've got quite a specific question here that we may have to take away, but I'll voice it over. So it's about a farm environment record, and particularly landscape scale farm environment record. And would that have an impact, and would they have to take it into account if they're making an application for landscape recovery?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. So that is one that we would have to take away, I'm afraid.
Yeah, let's take that one away. I've never had that question before, so we can take that away. I'm just scrolling through. So they've got one here about the different rounds of landscape recovery, and are they themed, and what's the upcoming themes looking at?
Yeah, so we started out thinking that we wanted to have some themes so that we could kind of compare projects a bit more like for like. So in the first round we had a species recovery theme and a river restoration theme, and those were separate competitions. And what we learned from round one was actually they had more there wasn't sort of stark differences really between the two sets of projects. Lots of the species recovery projects are doing great things around water and vice versa. And we've decided to run this round as one competition for all the projects, just to make it easier for everyone to apply. We do have a sort of particular focus. And as I said, for this round, it's going to be net zero protected sites and habitat creation. And that's areas where in government, we want to, particularly kind of make sure we're delivering towards our targets, do a bit of a push through the scheme on those areas. And so that will be reflected in the application process. So those are the kinds of things that would probably get the most points for the application, for the bids. And then other benefits you might be delivering will also get some additional points. I think it would be great to be able to set out a forward look of the different themes that we'd like to use in landscape recovery, so people know what's coming in future years. We're just not really at a point that we can do that because we're piloting the scheme. We're not 100% sure yet what kinds of projects the scheme is best placed to fund. We want to test how this works. And once we build that evidence base, then hopefully we'd have the evidence to be able to say, right, here's a forward look over the next X years of what we plan to do. But it's just a bit early days in this piloting process to be able to commit to that, which is why we haven't done it yet.
Thanks, Sophia. Another question we've got in terms of how do we make decisions on which projects get supported? So
in the application stage, we set out some criteria. So very broadly, they have some criteria around the environmental benefits and how we score those, something on the social benefits like public access. There's also some criteria on some sort of high level view of whether we think the project's deliverable. So that's where we're looking for evidence the project's thinking about how the different partners might work together and is sort of thinking in a broadly sensible way about that kind of thing. And we also look at the costs the projects are bidding for in the development phase. And then we basically, the projects submit a bid setting out what they're doing in those areas. it's scored by a panel. All the bids are scored by the same panel, and the highest scoring projects are invited into the development phase. And then once the projects are in the development phase, we'll work with them all to look at their implementation agreements. We'd love them all to go ahead. It might be that some of them we can't reach agreement on the implementation agreement, or they choose to go and follow up with other schemes instead of landscape recovery. But yeah, we would negotiate with each individual project what the implementation agreement could look like and make a decision with them about whether it goes ahead. If you want more information on that, the webinars I mentioned earlier have a lot more information on how we think this will work for round 2. And then there'll be full detailed guidance when we launch round 2 that will set out the criteria in lots of detail if you're, looking at developing an application, for example. Thanks,
Sophia. We've got time for a couple more questions, and sorry, we have lost Tim, unfortunately. So hopefully Tim tried his best to answer all of the questions we've got for Tim. We've got one question that seems to be coming up time and time again about how payments will be determined, Sophia.
Yeah, I just was noticing that was a bit of a theme. For the implementation agreements, that's something we'll discuss in the development phase with the projects. What we are envisaging is that the implementation agreement would be a single agreement between DEFRA and the project. So there'd need to be some kind of legal entity that would be the agreement holder and would manage that money. And then probably within that entity, they need to have agreements with the different land managers or partners delivering different parts of the project on what they're going to be paid for doing what. But that's all the kind of detail we're looking to develop in this development phase. Obviously, appreciate for lots of people people just want to know how much money is available. But the key thing about this scheme being bespoke is we don't have fixed payment rates. We're wanting to develop that with the project. So we won't be able to say it's X amount per hectare for blah, blah, blah. It's something we'll look at on a project by project basis. And as we're at the very start of the first round development phase at the moment, but as we work through that phase and start concluding agreements with these projects, we'll be able to share those as case studies with other people. So I appreciate the sort of lack of clarity can be a bit daunting for people, and understand people might not want to, apply for the scheme with that without an example agreement to take a look at. But that's something we'll hopefully have within the next couple of years, and then might be useful for people considering applying in future rounds.
Thanks, Sophia. I've got one final, well, there's 2 questions, but I'll roll them into one if that's okay. So I know we've got a lot more questions, but I think this is the what we've got time left for. So the first one is around, I've not heard of anybody in my area, but I'm really interested. Do you have a register of interest? And related to that, we've got some people asking for contact details because they want to discuss their project. So I thought we could cover all that in one.
Yeah, happy to do that. So we don't have a register of interested projects. It's something we might want to consider, but what I'd recommend is if you're interested in this in your area, then contacting the local Natural England area teams or catchment coordinators, sort of any local area experts from DEFRA Group, or potentially if you've got any environmental NGOs in your area who might be involved in discussing some of these opportunities. It's sort of using that network to see if there's other people in the area who might be interested in exploring this, and also any local kind of farm clusters, for example, through funded through any means, really. I think that's the best advice I can give you at the moment. It's something we've heard a bit in some of the feedback sessions recently about people wanting more support in joining up locally. So we'll have a think about if there's anything else we can do to help with that. And on contact details about discussing particular projects, we would love to be able to do this because it would be really helpful to us. The problem we have is that we want to make sure this is a fair competition and that we're not giving more advice to one project than another project, or sort of being seen to back certain projects before we've even opened applications. So unfortunately, at the moment, we are not having conversations with individual applicants much as we'd like to. The best thing I can offer you is, firstly, watch the webinars we've posted, which are much more detailed than what I've shared today on round 2. Secondly, read the guidance when it comes out and have a think about if it applies for you. And then once the application window opens, we have a question and answer process where you can submit questions if you're unclear on something, want to test if something is appropriate for the scheme, and so on. And we use that to respond to questions because we publish the answers publicly just so everyone's got the same information. And it's not totally ideal because we would love to be able to talk to you individually, but it's just the fairest way we can think of running this scheme given it's a competitive process.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Sophia. And I think that draws our time to a close that we've had today. Thank you very much, Sophia, for answering that barrage of questions. Really appreciated. And Tim, I know Tim's dropped off. Thank you. We'll extend our thanks to Tim for giving us an overview of where we are. Just a couple of things before we leave. We have recorded today's session, so we will be sending out the recording. We'll send some of the slides out so that you can have the opportunity to look over the slides from today. Abby has been busy posting links to the recordings that Sophia mentioned that we've doing of some of the other webinars, but also the farming blog as well, which is a great read for those of you that haven't signed up, that gives you more information on the first round of landscape recovery projects, but also wider information in terms of what we're doing in future farming. So please do have the opportunity to have a look at that. If you do have any questions about the pilot or tests and trials, we've just got our email address there for you to get in touch with us. Before you leave, please do complete the poll. We've just got a very short survey for you to tell us how useful you found today's webinars, and that'll inform whether we do more of these going ahead in the future. So hopefully you should see the poll now, so please do take the opportunity to vote on that. And I'll leave that open for a minute before we close the session. That's great, everybody. Thank you very much for submitting your answers in the poll. Thank you very much for attending today. And again, a huge thank you to Sophia, Tim, and the rest of the team for putting on today's session. I hope you have a lovely day. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.